The influence of the Arthurian legends on Phantastes is rather strong. But unlike what one might expect, instead of following parallel to the Arthurian legends, what MacDonald actually does is overturn them in significant ways. They have what might be called ironic reversals from the expectation of the reader who has now been saturated by these repopularized Arthurian legends. There are several different versions of knights that are encountered in Phantastes, but the first one that MacDonald's character Anodos sees is a humbled knight, maybe even a shamed knight. He's covered with rust, like Sir Percival, sad, gloomy. He says, I am ashamed. I was proud, but now I'm humbled. And it behooves me to tell you to take warning, lest the same evil in this kind overtake the singer, meaning Anodos, that has befallen the knight. This is a knight who has failed. He did not recognize the maiden of the alder tree and fell for her seduction, and now he is walking away in a humble and sorry state. So rather than the victorious knight who is riding away and can claim, Guinevere as his wife like King Arthur, instead he is humbled, he is forlorn and dejected, and that is the first knight that Anodos sees. The second knight that he sees, or that he realizes is necessary from himself, is when he is faced with the maid of the alder tree and she fools him and he almost dies. The necessity of the knight not to be one from courtly love who chases after Guinevere, but one who remains chaste and set apart. What he does here is he breaks this chastity to dire consequences. When he is in the fairy palace, he is not supposed to touch the statues, but he defies the law and flings his arm around the once alabaster maiden who has now become living, and he breaks this law and thus loses her. At another point, he takes a globe from a young girl's hand and breaks it and shatters it into pieces. He is not respectful of the laws of the place when it comes to these women, and the only one he gets close to and has any somewhat affection with is the maid of the alder tree, the dangerous seductress. And so he must learn instead to be a virtuous knight and not one of courtly love. He also learns to be a prepared knight, one that works hard but does not just claim the fame that comes with good deeds. In fact, the knights that he sees after he visits the cottage are two brothers, and they have been preparing and waiting for a long time for the moment to fight the giant so that all of them can fight together. They sit around together. There's a very round table imagery of these three brothers. But in this moment, when they are going to claim their victory, the two of them die. And Anodos also realizes that all of the hard work and preparation was a necessary virtue of being a knight, but it does not always lead to fame. Instead, their bodies are carried back to their father. And it is a reminder of the reality of knighthood, that it also can mean suffering and loss. Instead, after all of these failed attempts by Anodos to be a knight, the knight that he had as his ideal, he learns instead to be a squire for the first humbled knight that he sees later again in the second half of the novel. What we mentioned in the structure is it's more centrifugal or centrifugal. It's a more centrifugal structure. And so there's these circles that we have to see that the characters that we meet early on will come back in the second half of the novel. And so the knight who was once humbled is now a knight who is confident and who is virtuous. And he becomes a squire in training to this knight. All a man has to do is better than what he can. Renown and success are of no great value, which of course he also learned when he watched the two brothers die. Be content to be defeated. Go to work with a cool brain and a strong will. The result of a lifetime of good acts will content the right knight. And it's this attitude that Anodos finds in this knight, that he wants to serve this kind of nobleness. And by serving him, he actually does the most noble thing that he can at the very end of the narrative, when he sees that everyone else is falling for the surface of what things look for, which of course has been a temptation for him the whole time, right? Falling for the Maid of the Alder Tree because of what things look like. Instead, he sees through it and is able to unmask. He throws down the idol that everyone's worshiping. A wolf comes out of the hole, the hollow of the tree, and he sacrifices himself fighting against this wolf. The ideal of self-sacrifice, then, that one can save another, becomes the greatest ideal for the knight. Women. The narrative has several different ironic reversals of what one might think about a woman. For example, when the story begins and Anodos has the key, he opens the chest of his father's drawers and out pops this itty-bitty tiny woman. And he assumes, you can't do anything for me because you are so small. Again, he cannot see past the appearance of things when the story first begins. The woman then shoots up larger than life and says, is this better? And he becomes so attracted, he reaches out for her and she shoos him away. I could be your grandmother, even though she looks like a beautiful woman. So again, MacDonald is always working with what things seem like versus being able to see through to the reality. And that's what Anodos has to be trained in, is to re-envision women. Throughout the story, he is seeing them as women to be rescued. He actually says at one point when he sees the marble and there's a lady that comes alive through it, he remembers the story in Ovid of Pygmalion and thinks, well, that's a really nice story. Anybody who's read the Ovid Metamorphosis stories know the story of Pygmalion is actually not a great story. Pygmalion thinks he's so amazing and can't find any woman that is as virtuous as him, and therefore creates one out of stone and then prays to the gods that she comes to life for him. It's a very objectifying story of women. Anodos has to be turned away from this objectification of women to recognizing women in their virtue, in their goodness. He has lots of different sisters. He's surrounded by women in his real life, and the life in the fairy world teaches him to see women differently, to see them as human beings and not as objects to be rescued or as just mother figures to take care of him, but as full people. So these ironic reversals that happen in the story with all the different women characters unveils his false way of viewing women and gives him a better way of viewing women. At the very end of the narrative, he said he set out to find his ideal and ended by losing his shadow. So what is the shadow? This is probably one of the most powerful images in the narrative. This shadow will come up again in The Lord of the Rings. And I think that it's directly influenced by MacDonald's use of what the shadow is. Although he has already been warned, in the same way that the knight warned him against the Maid of the Alder Tree and he fell for it, now he has been warned not to go into the house of the ogress, and he goes into the house of the ogress. She warns him not to open the closet, and he opens the closet. So we get a sense that this young man is not following the laws of the land. He is not following the directives of other people, and that's one of the things he has to learn. By the end of the narrative, he will become a squire to a knight and will follow him and learn from him and obey him, and this will lead to his moments of great self-sacrifice before he exits fairyland. At this point in the narrative, he is his own man. He is an autonomous person who's not going to listen to anyone and instead do whatever he likes. And this autonomy actually leads him to be plagued by the shadow that comes out from the closet and is his double. The shadow finds him, and it follows him like an evil demon, like a dog. He begins to feel, though, that with that shadow, he enjoys it. And here we have a sense that evil becomes what at once is repulsive, you become familiar with and is no longer repulsive to you. This happens in Flannery O'Connor's fiction as well. You have a character who hears the voice of a devil and it sounds strange in his ear, but it becomes so accustomed to him that it sounds like his own voice, and he listens to it and follows it. Similar thing happens in George MacDonald's narrative, where the shadow at once was horrifying and was disenchanting the world, and now he sounds like a modernist with, I'm so glad the world is unenchanted. I don't want to see beauty if there's not any beauty to be seen, right? I want to be a realist who takes things as they are at face value and not see things as magical and as beautiful. The shadow fades in its influence at the fairy palace, but again, he disobeys the laws of the land and it comes back with full force. It overtakes him again in the forest after he has won against the giant, and we get a sense that the shadow is tied to pride. He sees himself as a knight. He thinks of himself not as a virtuous, noble person, which is what a knight should be, but as one who seeks fame and renown. I fancied myself Sir Galahad. So he has to learn to be released of this shadow. The only way that it finally disappears is when he's trapped with his shadow in a tower, only to realize he could have left any time that he wanted to. And the only thing that helps him leave is a young girl that he hurt, the one whose globe he broke. She sings for him, and the reminder of the song and her innocence and the fact that he hurt her and has to face that and see himself as one who does hurt, then releases him from the influence of the shadow. The narrative ends with him dying to himself. Someone for the whole narrative who has been an autonomous person, who has constantly been in control, pathless and directionless, but seeing himself as doing whatever it is that he wants to do. That level of freedom has only led him to the shadow, has only led him to hurt the women around him. And instead, once he is now a squire, he has the opportunity to save the knight and to save the lady that he drew out of the marble. He sees something that no one else sees. He dismantles the idol, and he is the one who at the end, when he dies to the wolf and dies by the swords of those who jump out against him, when he's buried, he breathes death, and it's a blessed state. Not only is his shadow dead, the passions are dead, and yet the souls of the passion, the good that's within them, lives and breathes freely. It's this image of a good death, and death being a blessing and not a curse, that becomes very influential over the Inklings. The narrative concludes with Enodos returning to the life that he came from, and yet bringing, in a sense, the fairy world with him. He asks, could I translate the experience of my travels into my common life? And that's what he attempts to do. Everything that he learned was not separate from the reality that he lives in. But that world was, in a sense, a stronger draft of the things that are true in the real world. That the fairyland, he is getting to see things as they really are. They look like goblins and old ladies with young eyes in cottages and giants and so forth. But that's just a revelation of the things here that loom gigantically, that should feel like shadows, right? The wisdom of those that came before us. All of those things exist in the ordinary world as well. So if his experiences in fairy can translate into a way of seeing things clearly in this world, then he can act in a way that moves against his shadow and away from his shadow and towards an ideal. At the very end, he's laying under a beech tree, and you get the sense that the fairy world is also the real world, as he hears a great good is coming, a great good is coming, and he feels that this is true, that what is coming is goodness, and that it is always coming. And this is the beautiful vision that MacDonald leaves people with, is the sense of the enchanted world we actually reside in. The world around us could be found as beautiful and as good if we only had eyes to see it.